Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide.
Once again, it's time for a dungeon ranking video, and we're now all the way back to the Burning Crusade. I think TBC dungeon design had two defining overarching characteristics. The first was the heavy use of dungeon hubs. With the exception of Magister's Terrace, every dungeon on this list is part of a hub of at least 3 to 4 dungeons and raids. And even Terrace is still in a mini-hub with Sunwell Plateau. Although somewhat limiting in concept, this wouldn't inherently be a bad thing if it didn't mean most of the sets of dungeons heavily shared assets, like excessively so. The idea of dungeon hubs wasn't new to TBC, as we had a few in vanilla, particularly Scarlet Monastery and Blackrock Mountain, but it was fully embraced here. Speaking of vanilla, dungeons back then had a high chance of being far more sprawling due to the original philosophy that you may only run them once. TBC took a very different view of things. While not as repeatable as M+ would eventually be, Blizz did intend for you to run these ones more often, evidenced by the very existence of heroic dungeons. And as part of that, we also no longer had any super long dungeons, with the most being 5 bosses. In fact, the idea of long dungeons wouldn't be revisited again until Legion. And even then, they were always made to be chopped up into smaller bits. But that's enough dilly-dallying, on to the list. Filling in the bottom slot, we have Black Morass at 16th place, also known as Opening of the Dark Portal. Are you shocked that it's this one? Well, quite possibly, actually, considering another stinker you might think belongs here. Look, it may have pioneered the wave defense dungeon design, but that doesn't mean it was ever a good idea in the first place, and it certainly doesn't mean it did it best. After a short tunnel, which is still set in the Caverns of Time proper, we emerge into the Black Morass, the precursor to the Blasted Lands. Logically, they made it look exactly like Swamp of Sorrows, which is fine if rather boring. And then, yeah, it's just your typical 18 waves with a boss every 6 waves, and better hope you don't wipe or you're in for a lot of re-clearing. Except what makes this place much worse than Violet Hold are some very simple annoyances that didn't need to be here. There's the shallow water that's still just deep enough to somewhat trigger swimming, especially on smaller characters. There's the fact that the portals are somewhat spread out and yellow in color on top of a sickly green environment, and with trees in the way, so it can be slightly annoying to see where to go. And there's the presence of all the wildlife that isn't super threatening, but which can be bothersome if you pull them when you weren't planning to, especially if the rest of your group already rode ahead of you and you have to deal with it yourself. The one saving grace of this place is the presence of the infinite dragonflight, which we'd had far less exposure to at this point in time. They genuinely look really cool, and their echoing voices were fun too. The time has come to shatter this clockwork universe forever, forever, forever. In an impressive showing, the Caverns of Time managed to secure the bottom 2 spots on this list. In 15th, we have Escape from Durnhold Keep, also known as Old Hillsbrad Foothills. It's pretty awful, but at least this one has you moving around more than 200 yards of ugly swamp. In fact, Hillsbrad is a fairly enjoyable zone to be in. Though most are off the beaten path, this dungeon does have quite a few Easter eggs of characters as they appeared in the past, including those involved with the Ashbringer and Kel'Thuzad. That's neat, but doesn't really improve the experience at all. After the Caverns of Time tunnel emerges into the foothills, you have 2 options: ride to Durnhold Keep or ride the Bronze Drake taxi. I think the Drake is faster, but it's not by a lot. It moves pretty slowly and takes a very winding path. Having that at the start of every run is very frustrating. Things improve significantly once we're at the keep. There are a good handful of guards stationed around the internment camp, and we need to maneuver our way to rig 5 explosives in the 5 cabins. This is fine and all, except for the mobs that tend to aggro through walls. Anyway, after the 5th bomb is set, the first boss will run to the lower level and begin patrolling until you engage him. Then you make your way into the basement of the keep proper, which is your bog standard vanilla layout. We release Thrall and begin the very lengthy escort. It's not so bad here, as we soon wind up facing the second boss, but then we get the mind-numbingly slow ride to Terran Mill and Taratha Foxton within. I mean, you can at least go to where Thrall stops and just wait for him, but also he'll dismount and fight any bears that he winds up too near, so technically it's faster to escort him properly. Anyway, it's then a bunch of scripted trash waves before we face the final boss, an infinite Drake. I do think it's a bit of a shame we didn't face off against Black more. I know that didn't happen originally, but a minor retcon to have them clash here and have Blackmore knocked out would have been fine. Or, just chalk it up to timey-wimey stuff. So, all in all, quite a slog of a dungeon that isn't nearly as exciting as Blizz probably thought it would be, but at least there's a direction and a narrative to this one. Next up, we have Alkanite Crypts in 14th place. This absolutely feels like the most forgettable TBC dungeon, which sort of makes sense, what with it being one of 4 in the Alkandune hub, and without having much of interest to it other than some leveling quests that send you inside. Its whateverness is a bit of a shame, because of the 4, it is the dungeon that should be regarded as the most true to Alkandown's primary identity as a mausoleum for the Draenei. Obviously, it's fallen into a decrepit state after the location's fall, but yeah, if you look around, sure enough, there's Draenei design elements. The place's main problem is that it combines the generally drab atmosphere of Alkandune with a minimally engaging experience. You fight your way through a fairly wide and very long hallway, then up some stairs, and make your way over to the dungeon's one really cool set piece, the Bridge of Souls. Chirac was always interesting to me just because of his cast speed reduction aura. Then after that, it's just more hallways and 2 rooms filled with skeletons before you get to the last boss, Exarch Maladar. Honestly, even just adding a 3rd boss somewhere in the first half would have behooved the place, as it's randomly one of only 2 dungeons with that view, the other being the far more interesting Forge of Souls. Ultimately, there's nothing awful here like the previous entries, it's just very whatever, In 13th place, we have the Sethic Halls, which when you really look at it is basically just Alkanite Crypts, but better in every way except for the Bridge of Souls. But it really does feel extremely similar. You just have Arakoa fighting you instead of Draenei. There isn't much else to say. Heck, at one point in time, it was even the other 2-boss dungeon. Eventually, Anzu was added as a summonable boss by druids who are working on or had already completed their epic flight form quest chain. But due to high demand for the rare Ravenlord mount and the fact that this place didn't have much else going on, they eventually made it a permanent addition for all players in Heroic. Also, to the place's credit, there's a shortcut back towards the start after Ikis. Speaking of Ikis, trinkets! Yes, pretty trinkets. Even though Ikis actually doesn't have a single trinket on his loot table, that quote will still live with me forever, which gives the halls at least 1 bonus point. But yeah, it's basically just crypts with burbs in it. Honestly, just combine the 2. You easily could and still would only be at 5 bosses, which is completely reasonable. Next up, in 12th place, we have the Botanica. It's what I would consider easily the least exciting of the Tempest Keep dungeons. Anything set inside a Draenei/Naru spaceship is automatically kind of cool, and I can appreciate the novelty of different zones plant life being cultivated here, but there's just not a lot to excite me. The first 2 bosses have basically identical fight locations, being mirrors of each other on the map, but that just makes them less memorable. It's not even a cool place to fight. The only remotely interesting thing is the little windows that let you peek in at Warp Splinter. I also hate the second boss since he has a tree form, and everybody uses his existence as definitive proof that Blood Elves should be able to be druids. I am not a fan of the idea, which I got into in a recent video. The third boss, Thorngrin, is probably the most interesting due to his sacrifice mechanic. Lodge is incredibly boring, and Warp Splinter is, I guess, marginally interesting due to his old man voice and being an arcane ancient.
Who disturbs this sanctuary?
But I just struggle to find anything to really compliment. It doesn't do anything awful, but let's just say I'm very glad we got an alternate exit so I don't have to backtrack through this place. In 11th place, we have Mana Tombs, which when you really look at it, is basically just Alkanite Crypts, but better in every way, except for the Bridge of Souls. Whoa. Deja vu. Like, the Ethereals just picked another wing and moved on in, so you've got the dead Draenei elements in the background and ethereal stuff in the foreground. There's not a ton to say though, the place is fairly simple in structure and pacing. Pandemonius was always a fun boss just because he would sometimes catch players unawares and kill them with reflect damage when his dark shell went up. And I always enjoy surprising groups by opening up Yor's prison in the final room. Hey, it's some easy time warp badges, and now it even gives a hefty reward for the ethereal endeavor. Shafar makes for a decent enough final boss. Make sure to kill his sparks before they transform into full-blown ethereals. and then you can just run past him and drop down pretty near the entrance. It's always fun when dungeons naturally curl back on themselves like this. 10th place goes to the Steam Vault, which I always rather enjoyed, but I don't entirely know why. It feels oddly cozy, despite being damp and full of hostile Naga and leper gnomes. Maybe it's just the implication that there's steam, which makes it sound warm. Of the 3 Coilfang Reservoir dungeons, this one most closely resembles the Serpentine Cavern raid, though still feels distinct. That's praise I would throw at all of the Coilfang dungeons. Despite sharing a hub, none of them feel too samey. Anyway, you have a lot of freedom with how to get to the first boss here. There are a bunch of mob packs, or if you want to stick more to the sides, you can deal with the bog giants. You're given more choice afterward because you can either take the main path to Mechgineer Steamrigger, or you can traverse the waterway shortcut. This will allow you to skip a few packs, but it's debatable if this would actually save you time or not. Still, I appreciate its presence here. He's a fun enough boss, just kill the healing ads. Leper gnomes are also just amusing, and after those 2, you unlock the final chamber and Warlord Calathrash within. Honestly, despite being a nice environment, I think it's held back by 2 rather uninteresting bosses and playing it a bit too safe with its overall design. A very average feeling dungeon. In 9th place is the Underbog, which is by far the most cavernous feeling of the Coilfang dungeons, and thus the most unique. There is a small degree of architecture in the form of the pipes and ramparts around the second boss, but otherwise it's all humid mushroom cave, complete with mushroom giants, mushroom elementals, and mushroom bats. The route is very linear, but does at least curve around enough that you can see ahead and behind in the dungeon. The second boss, Gazan, swims around in his room until you clear the trash, and then slowly makes his way up to the platform. You'll probably want to pull him before that, or just fight him on the pipes if you're smashing through the place. A fun detail that I always missed was that if you look back in his room, you can see the hall that you just came from through the shaded glass. The third boss is also noteworthy in that it's a broken hunter that tamed a Tauren bear druid. That's just funny. The last boss, the Black Stalker, sounds menacing, but is ultimately just an animal with no build-up, so it's kind of an underwhelming end. I do appreciate that you can then drop down right by the entrance, though. Not a super enthralling dungeon, but I do respect it, if that makes sense. Next up in 8th, we have the Slave Pens, which I think, historically, I've underappreciated, since it's the Coilfang dungeon that just gets thrown at us the most, between being the first level-wise and via time walking. It almost feels too basic at this point, but it honestly is the most interesting of the 3. It strikes a balance between cavern and structures, and the structures are definitely what sells it, mainly the giant bridge with ramps in the middle. They make for a very fun set piece to traverse, and if you have slow fall technology, a pretty generous shortcut. Or if you don't take the shortcut, you still get to jump down off the ramps into a pool of water. That's fun. I always remember Rockmar, the giant lobstrock of a second boss, for being my introduction to Grievous Wound's healing mechanics. The last third of the dungeon isn't super interesting, but it's nothing awful either. The whole dungeon features these broken slaves as well, who will go neutral if you kill their Naga overlords near them, but they won't if they're too far away. A bit odd, but maybe they're nearsighted. Either way, they're not too threatening, and though you will have to run back to the beginning for this one, you can at least skip the middle portion as there is a one-way ramp out of the water to facilitate that. In 7th place, we have Hellfire Ramparts, which holds the prestigious honor of being the first dungeon most players experienced in the Burning Crusade. And keeping that in mind, it does a decent job of combining simplicity with what could at the time be considered spectacle. Your path is extremely linear, save for one choice at the end, and you're in fact sandwiched between the titular ramparts for the first half of the run. You've got a few patrols to keep an eye out for, but what you really want to look at, whenever it's available, is the majestic view of Hellfire Peninsula, probably somewhat upscaled. After a brief spiral ramp, we can choose to head to Omok the Unscarred or Vazrudin the Herald. It irrationally irritated me that when achievements were added, they treated Omok like the final boss, when clearly that honor belongs to Vazrudin. One is just a typical terror fiend, the other is a fell orc on top of a frickin' nether drake. That was really dang metal for the time, alright? Plus, the bridge to Vazrudin conveniently has a drop down to the entrance. It's a very basic dungeon, but that's what it needed to be. No complaints here. 6th place goes to the Shattered Halls, which feel like they should be very boring. I mean, just look at the map. It's a bunch of halls. absurdly linear ones, in fact. The only branching path is just a dip into the sewers that you have to take unless you have a rogue or some other means of getting through the door and skipping that part. And there isn't even that much to what they made the halls with. There are pits of burning coals, there are giant orc statues. That's about it. Yet, despite that, the place does manage to shake up those few design elements enough to keep things somewhat fresh. Somewhat. After Nether Curse, there is a 55-minute timer to clear the rest of the place and stop an execution, which seems like it was a lot even back in the day. More a matter of if you can even clear the place or not. The third boss is slightly amusing, being a two-headed ogre that will randomly drop threat on his main target, and whose room has an open roof. I'm trying to look up more. And of course, we have Kargath Bladefist as the final boss, whose role here may be even more underwhelming than it was in WoD. Cool weapon though. At 5th place, the Mechanar was always a popular dungeon to run as a very efficient way to earn badges of justice, as it dropped from not only the 3 main bosses, but also the 2 mini-bosses that would later be reclassified, so basically it's 5 bosses in a very tight space. And yeah, the bulk of the Mechanar is just one big room, but it doesn't suffer for that, largely thanks to the considerable use of environmental obstacles that allow paths to form. Mechano Lord Capacitus was always a favorite of mine, as he took the polarity mechanic from Thaddeus and brought it into a dungeon environment. My groups would always have one polarity stand on top of the stairs and the other at the bottom, which is really more convoluted than it needed to be. Anyway, after he and his 2 lieutenants are dealt with, you can hop onto the comically short elevator ride to the second boss, who's fine. Then there's the bridge gauntlet, which, look, I'm not really into gauntlets, but this one isn't so bad. It's partially split up, so you can even take a break. But more importantly, it's really cool fighting on see-through bridges. It's also really cool fighting overhead where you just were. Combine those 2 concepts and you've got a great stretch of dungeon. And then the last boss is also fine. The place is also heavily filled with those pink boxes of, I guess, arcane energy, but they kind of just look empty, and it's funny to imagine they're just shipping these magic boxes around that you can clearly see have nothing inside of them. Also, we get another alternate exit, which is helpful. The place is small and simple, but makes good use out of what it has to work with. In 4th place, we have the Blood Furnace, which takes what could have been a lukewarm experience and makes it actually pretty good through a masterful use of environmental presentation. You start out having to make your way up a massive flight of stairs, with rogues skulking about on it. Then, once at the top, you're presented with a clear view down at the final boss's room, along with the pentagram that his ads are channeling. We move around half of this room's perimeter before veering off and dealing with other matters, chiefly some experimentation and augmentation of fel orcs. There's a whole laboratory hallway filled with them inside giant vats and stuff. The second boss was the Stuff of Nightmares, due to the series of waves you had to face before he would come out. Then, you make your way back to the perimeter of the final boss's room, this time descending to his level. It's a pretty cool boss arena that doesn't really get properly utilized. But just look at it. The room itself is huge, with neat swirly effects going off. It's massive. The roof is open, never realized that before now. And of course, below you is the Pit Lord Magtheridon as he appears in his one-boss raid later on, occasionally yelling out about how Illidan and his orc captors are gonna pay. You know, they very easily could have just folded this dungeon into the raid, but I guess they thought this was better. Lastly, you have a really long and scuzzy looking tunnel that you can blitz through with a speed buff to bring you back to the entrance. Much appreciated. The Arcatraz claims 3rd place, being clearly the best of the Tempest Keep dungeons. It starts out a bit whatever, but keeps getting better and better. You have waves of ads spewing into the first room. Please kill the Blood Elves even though they'll ignore you, otherwise the flesh spawn will just keep coming. We also soon encounter the first of 2 persistent annoyances this place loves, corpses that spawn little flesh spawn to attack you. We'll later also start getting the inert arcane golems that will zap those nearby with electricity. The first boss, Zaraketh the Unbound, looks kind of cool too. Remember how I praised the Mechanar for its transparent bridge? Hoo boy, this place has tons of transparent paths to enjoy. Our first comes leading up to the 2nd floor, where we then have to make our way through a room full of big Voidwalkers, and then a room of big Eridar. We then emerge into the room where Dahlia the Doomsayer and Wrath Scryer Socothrates were being held. The journal merely describes them as cellmates, but you can tell something romantic was going on between these two. I mean, they talk about commitment and stuff, but the banter between them is absolutely great. First, they're arguing with each other, then, as you pull one, the other will joke about it, whichever order you approach these two in. This feels like such a unique element to dungeon design that I haven't seen much elsewhere in WoW. I suppose the Mana Storm encounter in the other side, which was enjoyable but also different in nature since it was a single fight. Next, we're up to this fairly cool stairwell and across a transparent bridge overlooking the Voidwalker room. Oh my, you really know how to get me excited, Arcatraz. 2 more rooms of trash, and we reach the final encounter. A blood elf is releasing prisoners from their cells because remember, this is a spaceship prison. Most of the prisoners, and even the boss himself, Harbinger Skyrus, aren't super interesting in themselves. But what is interesting is that this is our introduction to the aforementioned Millhouse Manastorm, whose whole dialogue in this encounter is fantastic. The fight, involving a fair deal of RP and waiting around, could have made the end of this dungeon a real stinker. Instead, it's memorable for its humor. This whole dungeon is. Second place goes to Magister's Terrace. Is anybody shocked that it's this high on the list? If anything, you're probably shocked that it isn't at the very top. I mean, it's hands down the best designed of the Burning Crusade dungeons, due in no small part to it being the sole patch dungeon. Of course, it being entirely made of Blood Elven assets did it a ton of favors as well. I also have a lot of personal history with it. For whatever reason, I became completely obsessed with the Swift White Hawkstrider. I simply had to have it, and I managed to get a group of guildies to farm the place with me over and over again. And then kind of just assumed I should have it when it did drop, which in hindsight was kind of a jerk move, but I was a dumb teenager and I'm pretty sure they aren't sweating it anymore. The dungeon is great though, starting you out by crossing directly over where the third boss is waiting. The mobs here did tend to require a bit of strategy. Of particular interest to me were the Magisters, whose haste buffs I could spell steal, though it was stack based and a bit annoying to do so. Soon you get to the wretched AoE packs that you generally pulled behind the walls. Then the first boss, who required target switching and interrupts. After that, you get to a narrow hall that leads into a whole bunch of mana worms that you need to AoE down, and which grant you a brief 65% damage buff. This is great going into Vexillus, though he also summons adds which you can kill for even more insane damage buffs. 20% apiece, I believe. It was a simple but fun fight. Then, if we want, we can talk to Kalik for a sneak peek at Sunwell Plateau. And then we have a change of pace with the single target Fel Corrupted Arcane Golems that will chain lightning your group. A bunch of strategic group pulls later, and we find ourselves in Delrissa's room. A lot of trash here is optional, though you may want to clear some of it for space, because this fight could get hectic. I liked that it was the ultimate CC test for dungeons at the time, with 4 of 8 possible adds joining her that you needed to account for, with various crowd control abilities. Aside from the boss, who was a priest, there was a rogue, a warlock, a monk, a mage, a warrior, a hunter, a shaman, and an engineer. Foreshadowing perhaps? No? Yeah, probably not. This fight also required interrupts on the shaman and Delrissa herself, who would both heal, and ideally on the other casters, just to keep everything in check. Lastly, you make your way to the Fallen Kael'thas, who has a bunch of RP, but if you're still engaged with the trash before him, you can actually start the encounter and skip that. Neat trick. This bit of RP is where the infamous merely a setback originated from, as Kael was one of the first such bosses to survive his first defeat. I don't really like how TBC handled Kael, as I've stated in the past, so I am a bit sour about this bit, but the fight itself is pretty great. It's an extremely watered down version of his raid fight, and really just phases 4 and 5 of that fight, but it's still quite fun. Gravity laps, dodging arcane spheres, killing phoenixes and their eggs, and breaking through his shield to interrupt his pyroblast. Actually, doesn't that bit also happen in his Castle Nathria fight? Neat. Anyway, this place is just great and absolutely deserves to win this ranking video. That being said, it's not actually my favorite. That honor belongs to Shadow Labyrinth, and I can understand any surprise you may have at this. After all, I knocked all of the other Alkindun wings for being super redundant with one another. How could this Shadow Council ran wing rise above? Well, a few reasons actually. First of all, the lighting here is a bit darker, which is a trivial difference, but it does help. Things actually start getting exciting with the second boss, Blackheart the Insider. He presides over what appears to be some sort of makeshift chapel with cultists spread out before him. And you'd better make sure you kill them all, because they will pull with the boss. Blackheart himself doesn't do much outside of one key ability: Incite Chaos. This mind controls the whole party to attack one another for 30 seconds. Yes, you heard me correctly, 30 seconds. I don't even remember it being that long, but that's what the journal says. This leads to some hilarious runs. I don't even know if they let players die during this, but you can probably get pretty low. And of course, it was always infuriating having him pop your cooldowns for you. To counter this, you sometimes would want to use them yourself before the MC, but that doesn't help a lot with the defensive ones. You could also choose to spread out before the MC to use travel time to mitigate any damage that would be done. Pure anarchy, and I'm all here for it. I would honestly love having to deal with this in M+. But yes, we then have some mediocre mobs on the way to the third boss, except for the Cabal Zealots, who, when low on health, would transform into Core Hounds. And this was a magic buff, so mages could just spell steal this and enjoy being a Core Hound for 2 minutes. Marvelous. Blizz, give us more fun things to spell steal again. It should be our favorite ability to use. And lastly, we emerge into the final hallway, where cultists are fighting back against recolored Ragnaros. I mean Murmur. Look, even being pretty much a recolor, he still looks super cool. And him shooting attacks at the entire room full of mobs looks sick. And the fact that Auchindoun blew up because the council attempted to summon him here is really cool. This is just a fragment of his true form, which supposedly can shatter worlds. I mean, he is basically the elemental lord of sound, or basically vibrations. He's just really cool, and combined with Blackheart, manages to make this my favorite TBC dungeon. And that is all 16 dungeons. All we have left is vanilla, and then we can circle back around to the War Within. And yeah, on average, TBC dungeons were kind of lazily designed, but I still have a ton of nostalgia for them, and they help establish the norm of 3 to 5 boss dungeons going forward. Which may sound a bit boring, but honestly, I think it was a good precedent to set. The drawing this week is obviously of Shadow Labyrinth, and even though Blackheart is my favorite encounter in that place, Murmur definitely deserved the drawing. I actually did have quite a tricky time with this one. Because of his size, and because I wanted to include him fighting the Shadow Council, I had to use a weird angle, which got even weirder with the corners of the walls. Plus, I needed to somewhat identify the Shadow Council members, while still making them look like a unified force, and have enough props on the ground to feel accurate. Yeah, it was just a lot to manage. But I would say I am satisfied with the end result. Okay then, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!